Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation today in our LACOL workshop. My name is Nathan Goodale. I'm the Associate Dean of Faculty at Hamilton College and a faculty member in the Anthropology Department. And I just want to first welcome everyone to LACOL 2021, hosted by Hamilton College. And I'm thrilled to see so many people here and joining us in this virtual space. First, I'd like to give my thanks to Liz Evans, the director of LACOL, and our own Hamilton Steering Committee for their incredible work in organizing this 3-day workshop. My task today is to introduce our keynote speaker. But before I do that, I just want to note that there will be a Q&A session moderated by my colleague Beth Bolstead, in the Library Information Technology Services Director for Learning and Research Services at Hamilton. And as we have our presentation by Dr. Heather Pleasance today, that if you could please hold questions until the end and hold those questions for the Q&A session at the end, that would be excellent. So it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Heather Pleasance. Dr. Pleasance is a faculty development and senior assessment specialist at the University of Texas at Austin, where she works with faculty interested in integrating experiential learning into their courses. Dr. Pleasance is also an educational researcher and consultant who specializes in providing needs assessment, program evaluation, and external evaluation of funded initiatives, particularly those that address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Pleasance received her PhD in educational psychology in 2000 with a specialization in literacy, language, and learning from Michigan State University. She's a regular contributor to the work in the Digital Pedagogy Lab, and her most recent publication is Digital Storytelling in Higher Education, International Perspectives in 2017 from Palgrave Macmillan Press. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Heather Pleasance, who will be speaking to us today on reimagining the futures of learning, play in speculative places. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is my first virtual keynote ever. And I have to say, for everybody who has done this before, hey, shout out to you, because this is weird. This is really strange. Even though I've practiced it, it's still really strange. And I just wanted to add one other thing that I'm super excited about that has recently happened. I will be a senior associate editor for the Journal of Experiential Education starting in just a few weeks. And I mention that because the title of my talk is about play and speculative spaces. And I really hope that we get some submissions from folks who are interested in thinking and writing about play and speculative and playful pedagogy as a part of the work that's submitted to the journal. So just keep that in mind, y'all. And if you have any questions about that, I can share my email, or I can, you can hit me up on Slack for more information about that. But to get things started, I use she, her pronouns as my little nameplate in my little rectangle says. For folks who may be visually impaired, I just wanted to let you know that I have on a green top. I'm a light-skinned woman of color. Today my hair is straight. Tomorrow it may be curly, but today it's straight. I'd also like to start with a land acknowledgement. Even though we're all in different spaces and places, I like to kind of ground myself in, and hopefully you a little bit in the space that I'm at in Texas, and kind of also acknowledge the fact that we're participating in a digital space. So I'm just going to read this and then we'll go for it from there, okay? So I'm including this land acknowledgement as a way of honoring those who came before us and as a necessary first step in affirming the truth of our shared history. I invite you to get comfortable. I invite you to notice what is supporting your body in this moment, to locate your breath and take a deep breath in and out. And in doing so, I'd like to recognize the complexity and privilege of gathering online today by sharing this digital land acknowledgement written by Adrienne Wong of Spiderweb Show in Ontario. Since our meeting is shared digitally to the internet, let's take a moment to acknowledge the legacy of colonization embedded within the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not readily available in many Indigenous and marginalized communities. I invite you to join in acknowledging our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. Let's take a moment to honor the original stewards of our lands and regions wherever we are. Let's honor all of those who have been detribalized, all who have been colonized, all of those who were formerly enslaved, especially since we just celebrated Juneteenth, which originated here in Texas. Let's recognize and honor those who encounter hatred due to their sexual orientation, their gender, their ability level, and in particular, all who continue to face anti-Blackness daily because the color of their skin has been weaponized. I invite you to take a deep and collective breath in and exhale. Please rejoin together in this virtual community. I also want to just acknowledge the layers of this moment. As I kind of started off before the land acknowledgement, we're still in a pandemic, even though many folks around the country, including in Texas, have pretty much stopped wearing masks. So we're still in this context, though, together, but we're also in community with one another. I imagine that even though this is my first time hanging out with you at this conference, I imagine that this is kind of a space that is defined by being with one's people. And so I think it's just great for us to acknowledge that we're all here together and participating with one another. So, playing in speculative spaces. I also want to get started, in addition to mentioning the land acknowledgement, by getting present in a different way with you. And as a beginning point, I'd like us all to participate in continuing to create a bit of community with one another through a shared experience. Now, I haven't scrolled through the rectangles that comprise who we are in this moment. I can only see the people who are alive, but I imagine that there are also people here who exist only for me as a name on a black screen, or who are frozen, and that is who they are for me in this moment. So if that is you, and I cannot see you, I just encourage you to participate in this with us, because I do believe that we can create a shared experience virtually. And so I'd like to try to do that here. So I'm going to ask that you close your eyes and think about your fondest memory of being at play and playing with others when you were younger. Now, younger could mean last week, last year, when you were a child. Whatever that memory is, just picture that now. See that moment as vividly as possible. Conjure up how you felt in that moment and hold that feeling just for a few seconds. You can open your eyes, and I'd like to ask you a few questions. You can put your answers in the chat. I won't be looking yet at the chat, but I will be in a little bit. But if you want to put your answers in the chat for folks who are participating in that way, please feel free. The first question I'd like to ask is, in your memory, who was with you in that space, either literally or figuratively? Because we call different people, different characters into our play at different moments, right? So kind of think about, like, who was with you literally and figuratively? Second question, what was it that made that moment particularly memorable for you? It could be what happened in that moment. It could be the sense that you've made of that moment after that moment occurred. But just kind of think about what made that memorable for you. Lastly, who was included and who was excluded in that play? And maybe everybody was included at that particular moment. But I think I'd like to have us keep in mind, some central ideas as I talk with you today. And I'm asking these questions because there are three really key concepts or thinking spaces that I like to occupy when I think about play and playful pedagogy. One of those is, what are the diverse knowledges that we bring into play and playful pedagogy? Another question is, when we think about assessment, and I am an assessment person, I say that as an insider-outsider because some of my assessment peeps, they're a particular kind of person. And I'm a particular kind of person. So just like if I say I'm assessment, when I say I'm assessment person, just don't judge me, right? Just reserve that judgment. But I do like thinking about like assessment. So I asked what made that moment memorable for you, because I'm thinking like, how do we assess what's memorable and important and authentic, right? And then I asked about who was engaged in your play, maybe who was left out, because I also want us to think about equity. And so we'll return to these themes a little bit later in my talk, but I just wanted to get us started by grounding our own thinking in each of those questions using that memory that we have of playing with others. Play is pretty much an embedded part of who I am as an instructor. And as I was preparing for this talk, I thought about the first experience I had in asking folks in a higher education context to play together with me. And that experience was something called the Technology Playground Workshop. Some colleagues of mine at the University of Alabama, Jennifer Roth Burnett and Andrew Richardson, and I created this workshop for the first time 6 years ago. And in that workshop, groups of people, most of whom either had never met or only knew each other kind of in passing, got together in small groups, and they used their personal and professional interests, as well as random technology tools that were literally drawn out of a cup that were written on like slips of paper. This is super low tech. They used their interests and those random technology tools to create interdisciplinary courses together in the span of 20 minutes. We didn't know what was going to happen. And I couldn't remember exactly what happened when I was getting ready to talk with y'all today. So I sent a text to Jennifer. I was like, hey, send me a few pictures. I know we had some screenshots of the big Post-it paper that people wrote the titles of their courses on. So just send those to me, and maybe I can use them in my presentation. So I'm going to share those with you now, and feel free to put any impressions that you have of these courses in the chat. So the first one was called Going Viral: The History of Epidemics in Pop Culture Media. The next class was Beyond WebMD: Finding Reliable Health Information on the Internet. This cracks me up. And the last one, just because, if we haven't gotten apocalyptic enough, the last class was Hodgeball. And I'll read it out loud for folks who might have some visual issues. Manufacturing Hodge meteorite, 3D printing, mold making, cast Nerf footballs of the meteorite. Students will study the history of the meteorite. We'll do some multimedia documentation, and there will be a writing assignment. Because part of this was also, what are you going to have students do within your course? So I share these, like I promise you, I did not know what she was going to send me. And it just goes to show you, when we engage in play, whether it's pedagogically or otherwise, we may have very little idea about the prescient connections between play and future possibilities for learning. And of course, these examples also clearly connect us to our current context. I was thinking about it a little bit more after I just kind of ruminated on that experience, because we offered the workshop several times after that as well. And especially in light of what we're all collectively going through now, I kind of started to think about the fact that our experience of the pandemic could perhaps be seen as like this large, massive global instance of let's pretend, right? And think about the ways that we have been pretending to do or to be in certain ways since the pandemic became part of our collective lived experience. The thing that comes to mind most immediately right now, since I'm presenting, is jokes that I've made, and I'm sure some of you have made, about coming to work in our pajamas. I want to assure you, I have on jeans. I do not have on pajama bottoms. But it's just interesting to think about, right? And examples of our willingness to pretend within and outside of the pandemic context are ubiquitous, right? So in the lower left-hand corner, we have BBC interview guy, otherwise known as Professor Robert Kelly, who before the pandemic had his two children bust into his interview. And he famously commented afterwards that he thought he would never be able to do an interview again. It just changes how we think about things, right? Now that we're at where we're at, like, oh yeah, no, it'll be okay, right? It'll be okay. In the top right-hand corner, we have a screenshot of a Texas courtroom hearing in which a lawyer, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, could not remove a filter of himself as a cat and assured the judge that he was ready to go forward, and also that he was not, in fact, a cat. So there are instances of these willing and unwilling opportunities for play that abound, particularly in our current context. And our students, of course, are much more practiced than we are at playing with context and with content. So this is a screenshot from an article about the role of BTS stans, another word for fans, for those of you who are not into K-pop culture, who sabotaged Donald Trump's rally in Tulsa by purchasing thousands of tickets and then not attending. In a lot of ways, I kind of feel that our students have been raised, because they've been raised in this era of hyper curation of self, they are much more savvy. And for example, I interpret their unwillingness, because I work with faculty of all different kinds at all different levels in the institution. I've heard us talk about students in terms of, why won't they have their cameras on? And my daughter's actually one of those students who sometimes doesn't have her camera on. And in talking with her, what I realized is that not having one's camera on, and we've gotten much more sophisticated in terms of how we think about this over time as well, but it's an indication of agency, right? Of an unwillingness to accept some sort of arbitrary rules about what participating in Zoom classrooms should look like. So, what have we learned from what might be considered the most massively multiplayer online game of pretend ever? What have we learned? And you can put your responses in the chat. And if you do, I thank you. I'm not going to look at those right now because I am at my bandwidth with having multiple screens open and doing this presentation, but I promise you I'll look afterwards. This is a screenshot of a YouTube video that some of you might have seen of a young lady who was talking with her future self. And unbeknownst to her, there was a pandemic. And so this is her future self saying, you know what? Put a little money in Zoom. Yeah, right? So we've learned a bunch of things through our experience over the last year and a half or so. Certain things come to mind for me during this presentation. One is that time is fluid, right? Our conceptualizations of time, our lived experience of time. I have come to know Wednesday as First Friday because, Monday and Tuesday are so long. They're so long, by Wednesday, I'm like, I am ready for happy hour. So guess what? Today is Friday. It's the first Friday, almost like in Lord of the Rings, first and second breakfast. Wednesday is first Friday for me. Second thing that we've learned, or that I've learned personally, maybe you've learned this too, is that our students are incredibly resilient. And the third thing, there's many more things that we've learned, I hope you're putting this in the chat, is that we have the ability to make radical changes in teaching faster than we could have ever imagined. And so if we can make hairpin turns in our pedagogy during the pandemic, how might we navigate ourselves into the future? And one possibility that I'll be talking about, or that I have been talking about, is to continuously take seriously the idea of embedding play within our teaching. So why play in higher education, and why now? Well, teaching and learning is serious work. As teachers, we may be feeling a sense of dread or a lack of confidence in our teaching because of what we've been asked to do over the past year and a half. And also maybe our work has brought us into a new level of competence and confidence in areas that we were previously unfamiliar with. So I'd like to affirm in this moment that although our perceptions of our competence in teaching may have been shaken, they've also gone through tremendous growth. And so perhaps thinking seriously about play can give us an entryway back into our teaching that kind of, at least a little bit, circumvents some of the really challenging circumstances that have been weighing on us for this past year. So as we talk about play, I'd also like to highlight and foreground the idea that though the wider academic community is somewhat new to the idea of using play within pedagogy, there is a very long history of this work and scholarship within, just to name two examples, the performing arts community, within early childhood education as an area of study. I'm thinking about books like Dramatic Play in Childhood, a more recent book, Play, How It Shapes the Brain by Stuart Brown, and going back a little bit further, the work of Nellie McCaslin, Dorothy Heathcote, Winifred Ward, and the work of folks who are connected to and have been connected to Karamu House in Cincinnati. And I need to give a shout out to my colleague, Siobhan Coleman at the University of Texas in Austin, who is one of our educational consultants in the Faculty Innovation Center. She comes from a performing arts background, and so she kind of helped me to think through some of the history and legacy around play in and outside of higher education. So there are many, many different definitions and typologies of play. And when I was thinking about presenting to y'all today, I thought, gosh, I got weirded out a little bit. Like I felt like, oh, I got to put all these things up there. I'm like, nope, not doing that. Because less important than a unitary definition is the significance of play in human life. As Sutton Brown has demonstrated, the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. And John Seely Brown, another one of my the folks I look to when I think about play and what it means to me, has talked a lot about and written a lot about play as fundamental to human development and thinking. Okay, oops, keep going, there we go. Less important than a unitary definition is also the affordances of play. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, I just have a bunch of different principles of play that are offered up by a group of folks in Denmark who for several years did a conference called Counterplay. And in that list of the principles of play, I'm not making any claims about the veracity of any of these principles, but I do find them to be true by and large in my own work, that play enables purpose. It creates opportunities for joy. It helps us think about diversity. It brings our curiosity and imagination to the forefront. It fosters connection, empathy, trust, agency. So the affordances of play are just as important as any type of definition or typology that we could offer forward. A focus on play and its affordances also allows us to continue to be student-centered. As some folks have said, the students in many cases are the course, and the affordances of play provide us with opportunities to get closer and closer to constructing learning with our students. And as I've demonstrated earlier, students are already engaged in tacit and expressed play as a part of their everyday lived experience. I thought seriously about including some TikToks here, but I thought better of that because that's just a rabbit hole that we don't need to go down at this point in the presentation or just in general today. Maybe after the presentation, but I made the choice to not include that right now. And then lastly, how we orient ourselves to play as instructors, I think, is pretty important for us to think about, more so than looking for one specific definition. So at this point, I'd like to ask you to insert your course here and think about either a course that you're currently teaching, that you might be teaching in the fall, that you would like to teach. And as I go through the next few slides, just kind of think about and reflect on how might this relate to this course that I have in mind. Also, I just wanted to give us maybe a few unfinalized rules for playful pedagogy before we get started thinking about our own courses. And these are just Heather's rules for playful pedagogy. That's why I have rules in quotes. Feel free to add your own rules in the chat if you would like, but I thought we would start with these 5. First, I initially wrote, we need play in our lives in order to bring it into our pedagogy. And I was just like, scratch that. We just need play in our lives. Like if this moment has taught us anything, we need moments of levity, moments of joy, moments of playfulness. Because if we're not playing, we can't expect our students to. And in the same vein, if we don't take risks, our students won't either. Because play involves taking risks. Play also takes practice, and vulnerability is a requirement. So on the right side of the slide, I have some excerpts from a course I'm teaching in August with Felicia Caton. And she and I are going to be instructors at the Digital Pedagogy Lab. And we're teaching a course on speculative fiction and the connections between speculative fiction and the future of education and learning. And so I made this comic strip because I'm a Canva fanatic. I don't know if any of y'all use Canva, but you can make all sorts of delightful things using Canva. And I said, let me just do something playful to invite our incoming students into this course with us before we're doing the course during that week. So I don't know if you can see it, but I also gave myself 3 eyes and some vampire teeth in one of those slides because why not? So just some tentative rules for playful pedagogy before we get started. And so now I'm going to come back to those 3 ideas that we touched on in the beginning with your play memories. And I think for me, what's been generative is to begin in 3 places. First, thinking about diverse sources of knowledge, speculative equity practices, and also taking assessment out of our hands as a way to create opportunities for playful pedagogy. So I'd just like to talk about those really briefly and kind of have you think through with me and with your course in mind, what that might look like in your experience. So diverse sources of knowledge. The first example that I have, and I wanted to put this in the slide, but I didn't. So I'll just explain it to you. So I've taught in the past a class called Race, Place, and Civic Media. And one of my favorite semesters had a group of particularly creative and playful students. And this was a class that was, it wasn't a required course. So anybody and everybody could be a part of the course. And I had one student, and his name was Aiden, and he loved fungus. And he made all types of jokes about being a fun guy and all, all that type of stuff. So in my class, he brought in his interest in fungus to his project, and he made an Instagram account called Mycology Monday. And on Mondays, he would post a picture of a fungus and talk about it. And then he invited students from local elementary schools to find pictures of fungi, and their environments. And on Fungus Friday, he would choose their photos and talk about the characteristics of those funguses. So diverse sources of knowledge, I think, are very important in being playful. Also, in that same class, I had a student who did a GIS mapping project that documented fish fans across the globe. And so in doing that project, she actually had to learn some coding. Okay, enough of that example. I'm noticing my time, so I'm going to try to be mindful of that. Yeah, I've also written a book called Community-Based Digital Literacies and Multimedia Projects, in which my co-editor and I intentionally sought out projects that were national, international, and that represented diverse sources of knowledge. So I can share that with folks if you're interested, because it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of as a scholar. So I'd like you to think about these questions. How might I playfully include diverse sources of knowledge in my course or courses? What diverse sources of knowledge might my students suggest if given the opportunity to recommend some to me? And you probably, knowing this group, have already thought about this and already have some suggestions and things that you put into practice. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that as well. Second concept, taking assessment out of our hands. Originally, I called this slide playing with data, and I just figured I'd leave him there, just because I'm a Star Trek nerd. Hopefully there are some other people out there like me. But I changed the name of the slide to taking assessment out of our heads, because I think when we give our students opportunities to think with us about what makes their experience meaningful and what does it mean to know something in our courses, things happen in those spaces that we wouldn't anticipate. For example, in the Race, Place, and Civic Media course that I taught, I created a rubric with my students that we implemented in the middle of the semester. And we talked together about, well, okay, so if you're doing these projects, how should they be assessed? What is meaningful to you, right? How are you defining the impact of your project? What do you want to learn? How should you or I make some assessment about whether you've learned the things that you want to learn? And so we co-created the rubric that we used at the mid-semester point of their project, rather than at the end, because I think formative assessments are much more fun for students to think about than summative assessments, and much more important, actually. So that's one example. Another example that I was thinking about is, what if you asked your students to explain, and I see I have, okay. Another example, which I'll not include right now. What if you asked your students to explain something to someone who was, and this is taking for granted the idea that you're working with undergraduates, right? So what if you asked your students to explain something in your class to someone who was 13 years younger than them, or 50 years older than them? And especially with us being in this pandemic context, I had in mind, all right, who do students have access to, who they could explain a concept to? Well, they might have brothers and sisters around. They might have, parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles. And if you've ever tried to explain your dissertation to your granddaddy, you know how difficult and challenging this is. So I feel like this is a very authentic assessment and a very true test of students' knowledge. So what if you had them record those explanations, as well as the person who's listening, record their responses, right? As a true test. Question for you. I know I just talked about rubrics. People have a love-hate relationship with rubrics. I just want you to just think for yourself, is there any hope for rubrics in your lived experience? If there's not, that's fine. I'm not, there's no judgment here. I found them to be helpful, especially if we don't take them seriously as, this is the sum total of everything that you should know in my class. And if we don't connect it to that no child left behind-ish type vibe that our students have been brought up in, I think that there is some hope, but it does take a little bit of work. Okay. Speculative equity practices. This is the third area. And I have 2 examples to share here. And I know I'm almost out of time, and I'm almost done. So that's good. The first example is an example that's a little bit difficult for me to talk about because it was a fail on my part. So several years ago, I was teaching digital storytelling to a group of kids at a public housing community in a small city in Alabama. And because of our work, it was me and a colleague, Sharon Nichols, that were working together in this context. We were given an award by the university. And so we had the idea that what we would do, because we were learning and teaching with the kids in the context, that was kind of our ethos. We thought, well, what we'll do is we'll bring them to accept the award with us, because that is, the award is as much theirs as it is ours, right? So we got to campus, and we're about to go into the ballroom where the award ceremony was taking place. And several of the young men, these are all kids of color, African-American students, several of the young men literally hid under the seats in the van that we had brought them to campus in. And it was at that moment that I realized what a horrible mistake I had made, because for the students we've been working with, the university itself was a fictional space. They had never been there. They didn't know what to expect. They didn't even know what the inner campus looked like. And I had not prepared them. So of course I didn't make them go into the awards ceremony with us. And in attempts to redress the harm that we had unknowingly caused, we took some steps after that to try to make them more comfortable with this environment that they had previously been unaware of. And looking back, hindsight, wow, you think, yeah, of course you do that. But, that was just a moment where we fell down in our responsibility to our students. And it makes me think about when we're conceptualizing equity practices, we really have to think broadly, particularly when we are engaged in teaching and learning with undergraduates and with folks in a community setting. So what does it look like to implement equity practices with our students and with the folks that our students work with? Is a really important question for us to consider. The second example that I have also goes back to the Digital Pedagogy Lab class that we're going to teach. And we took a risk with this one. We asked the organizers of the conference, for our course that we're offering, could we specifically gear our invitation to participate to BIPOC attendees, and kind of put a priority on those folks? Because in thinking about speculative fiction and topics such as Afrofuturism, Afropessimism. We really wanted to not create an instructional space or teaching and learning space in which the very folks that we wanted to engage with were still within a particular underrepresented group within that space. And I think it's important to try to create those spaces because you don't know what can come out of it if there are opportunities for those kinds of conversations to take place. And the conference organizers said yes. And so we have a very diverse group of attendees. And actually, I'm both proud and kind of freaked out to say that our course was the first course to be enrolled to capacity in this year's DPL. So a question for you is, how might you engage your students in thinking with you, with us, about equity with their futures in mind? I'm gonna, I think, stop there. Or perhaps just with this last slide, now what? So that we can talk about the now what, given what I've shared with you today. I hope this has been a helpful space for thinking about this work together, for thinking about play, for thinking about the role of the speculative within our lives and within our pedagogies. And with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing so that we can have a collective conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Pleasance. I think we need to give a great round of applause. Thank you. That was amazing. We have about 15, 20 minutes now for some question and answer. And then at 2:30, we'll have more of an informal meet and greet. So you can put your questions in the chat, or if you prefer to raise your hand, I'll try to get to people in order and call on you and let you unmute and speak your question straight to Dr. Pleasance. But first of all, the first question that was already been mentioned in the chat a couple of times is, can you please give a list, provide a list of all those books you mentioned? Several people, their ears perked up and they would love to have a list of those books, including the ones that you've written. So
absolutely. And actually, I'm gonna I have a couple of the books that I don't think, so Brian Alexander, his talk was just out of this world yesterday. And he has a lot of the books that I was going to cite
of course,
on his list, of course, right? But I may have a couple that he may not have. And I'm just going to try to hold this up. So this one is called, if you can see it, not really, Black Utopias. The subtitle is Black Speculative Life and the Music of Other Worlds by Jana Brown. I'll send a list of all of these to y'all, but I just wanted to show a couple to you. Design Unbound is a book that John Seeley Brown wrote with Ann Pendleton Julian, and is based on a smaller book that he's written about the importance of play within innovation and just human thinking in life. I don't know if that's on Brian's list or not. I also have this book, Syllabus. I'm sure some of you are already familiar with Linda Berry's work. And I would also recommend Nick Susanis' work on flattening, which is a dissertation written in the form of a graphic novel. And then I have one last book that may be somewhat unfamiliar to folks, and that is this book. It's called Black Futures. Ooh, it's almost like not even real. Wow. Oh my God, there it is. There we go. And this book is just a fabulous exploration of nonlinear storytelling and information and art and questions and representations. And it's been one of the books that has guided my thinking about the course that we're going to teach in August. Yes, thank you, Katie. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Several people have been popping some of those titles in the chat, so I encourage everyone to save the chat before you leave today. So, does anyone have any specific questions they would like to ask Dr. Pleasance?
Yes, absolutely. And I would show you a copy of the book that that I wrote with Dana Salter, but I gave them away to like my mom and my dad, and my uncle asked for books. I literally don't have any of my own books anymore. So.
I have a question for students that kind of start off the class where they might feel like, this is something that they're taking that's required, or that they just don't totally feel connected to the material or how it applies to them. Do you have like a set of kind of icebreakers that you use to get their kind of creative juices flowing or get them interested in the material?
Yeah, there are a couple of different resources that I would suggest. But I often fall back to kind of making a foundation on some of the principles of experiential learning that have been shown to be evidence-based and good practices for students. The first thing that I do, this is just me as an instructor, I know that if my students don't trust me, they're not going to come with me on any type of journey, playful or not. And so a lot of the work that I do initially is focused on building trust and transparency and openness, both in terms of how I interact with them and how they interact with each other. Simple things like getting into the habit of using each other's names when they are in a classroom, whether it's virtual or not. So, Beth, thank you for saying that. It was really interesting when you said X, right? So that's important. The practices that I'm thinking about with experiential learning have to do with preparing students, first of all, right? So when you tell a group of your students, here's what this class is going to be about, and I'm going to give you some practice at doing this right away so that you have an understanding of what it is that we're going to be continuing to focus on. And that practice is going to be non-graded. You can maybe get some points for it still, but it's just going to give us an opportunity to work out the kinks and for you to ask me some questions about things that you might not understand. Communicating intentionality to your students. This is why we're doing this. This is why we're engaged in these activities. And then, of course, play in the context of pedagogy. Not that it's meaningless, I wouldn't say that, but without reflection, which is, again, one of those hallmarks of experiential education and experiential learning, without opportunities to reflect at many times during the course of their time with you, so much potential of that learning experience is lost. So right away, I would say build trust, build transparency and openness, be open about why you're doing what you're doing, give them some opportunities to practice, kind of prepare them in different ways. And then also I would suggest, if y'all haven't been to the One Higher Education website, that is developed by Meheb Bali and Autumn Keynes and others, I would highly recommend taking a look at some of the resources that they have. One of my favorite things that they have, so they invite just lots of different folks to contribute, and they make videos on the teaching tools that different folks from around the world have used. And one of my favorites is an exercise called Tiny Monsters. So if you go to the website and look up Tiny Monsters, I think that it might spark something for you. One of the things I like most about the One Higher Education website resources is that many of them will say, in terms of instructor preparation and student preparation, none, which is very important sometimes, especially in this context. Like if I have to do any type of prep or like some type of extensive prep, I may not do it. But if you tell me I don't have to have any prep besides watching this video, hey, I'll give it a shot. So check those out if you get a chance.
Thank you. Any other another question? Just shout out or raise your hand or put it in the chat. And thank you, Fuji, for putting the website for One Higher Education in there. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. It's always difficult for me to find, so I really, really appreciate that.
The beauty of having two screens.
Yeah. Actually, I had just looked it up too, so you beat me to it.
I want to ask you, Dr. Pleasance, what you just said about no prep. So in my course, Environmental Science Policy, one of the things that I found, and we have these stakeholder meetings where students act out particular roles and they start making deals, the almond farmer and the whatever the topic is. I've actually found it takes more prep because partly is the students are finding nitty gritty details about this or that, and it's stuff outside my expertise. And plus the issue, and I don't mind the more prep, it's kind of fun. But the issue is also, it always invokes drama because a lot of play or a lot of these activities are group. So the group grade, group assessments, and there's always drama, which it's part of teaching. I'm not saying, but the thing is, it just involves, because students are used to the solo, I get graded on this. When people have to cooperate together on a project, on whatever, it's a different ballgame. And I think it's an important lesson for them to learn working in a group, but it is more challenging as a teacher.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that we do, the prep is worth it because it's central and super important. And I hear you about the drama. Anything that I talk about, just know that this is just me as an instructor. I'm not making any claims about whether this is efficacious for anyone else. But because of my background, some of my anthropological training, sociocultural background, and just because I tend to use humor in my teaching as well as my presentations, in the same way that I build trust right away, I call out the tacit and implicit ways that people interact with each other in the classroom right away, like right away. And I do so with humor, but we still talk about it. And, that, of course, is a part of the ground rules that we normally develop. But sometimes when you develop ground rules, you get away from them pretty quickly. And I really take time to look for opportunities to come back to those at the beginning of the semester. I definitely have been known to be like, okay, and it maybe, I play on my culture thing. I'm a mom. I have a 19-year-old, I can be mom because I am a mom. I'm like, hey, I saw you looking sideways at me about such and such. Like, what is that about, right? Or like if they're in a group situation, the energy here seems really tense. What is going on with y'all, right? And just make it a part of the classroom conversation. Again, that may not be the route that works for everybody, but I really enjoy it because students are generally open to meeting me where I'm at if I approach them in that way. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, I asked something that was not answerable. I'm also an anthropologist. Maybe that's the problem.
Yeah. No, that's not a problem. That is not a problem. That's a good thing.
Actually, that kind of, I had a question I had written down. One of the things you mentioned about things that we've learned through the last year and a half or so is that students are resilient, and I've been hearing, we've all been hearing a lot about the deterioration of students' mental health. And so in one sense, maybe they've survived, but I guess maybe I'm asking you to speak to their mental health and resiliency in light of how play maybe could make a difference in that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, just like we're not a monolithic, group as instructors, our students aren't either. Some students have thrived in this context and really love virtual learning, teaching and learning. Some students really haven't. And, everyone in between, right? So the mental health issues are real. I find that I'm going to go back to that tiny monsters exercise, just because if we can bring conversations about challenges into our teaching and learning contexts in ways that are sensitive and respectful and playful, I think that helps everybody. And from what I'm hearing from folks here at UT, even if they're not bringing play in, so, play just like creates even more and more possibilities. But because of the pandemic, I think a lot of our instructors are becoming more deeply aware of the complex lives and experiences of our students in ways that they hadn't been before. And I hope that we're able to take that knowledge, that understanding, and that empathy forward as we continue to think about how best to create courses that are equal to the challenges our students are facing both now and in the future.
And we do have the next half hour for kind of a meet and greet. So if you want more casual conversation, then that's the time for that. Liz, are you in charge of that?
I am, and
Okay.
my one comment is just that we're shifting into a little bit more of a casual mode, mostly meaning I'm going to turn off the record button. So if you happen to be one of those people who is wearing pajamas underneath, feel free to stand up after that point. But if you can stay on, please do, and we'll just have a chance to chat with Heather a little bit more casually.